Welcome everybody to our Leaders in Housing Counseling call. Glad to have you here. I think we're continuing to move forward in a world of COVID-19 defining everything we do, but I continue to hear exciting and valuable stories about the work you're doing out there in the field. We really appreciate this. We have had a variety of things happening where we have really been able to elevate housing counseling in the field, and really appreciate the work you're doing, and it's getting recognized around the country and among policy circles. So I want to just first do a quick shout out to the great work that all of these counseling agencies do, that the work that you're doing, and please, I know that it sometimes might feel like you're by yourself, but in fact there is a big sense of the significance of your contributions, and we really value that. We just had a meeting with the head of the CFPB, Kathy Kraninger, had a number of you on to talk about the problems people are having dealing with their mortgage servicers. I thought it was really excellent, but it was also very clear that they had reached out to us to find out what was happening in the field, and that you are the resident experts. And I want to just confirm that and make sure that you all hear that loud and clear. We're going to jump right in because we have a very crowded agenda, and we're squeezing lots of people in because the content is high, and we want you to make sure you receive this. So do you want to flip over to the agenda quickly? And let's get started. We do have very good news on the legislative front. We made some progress on housing counseling funding through the COVID-19, and also on some of the legislation we've been working on for a while. Melody will fill you in on the details. So I'm actually not seeing the agenda on my screen. So if that's coming, that would be great.
I switched it, and I switched it quite a while ago, actually.
Okay, so maybe just my screen. So there we go. Aha, just running slow, that's all. Good, so we have the, one of the issues here is on the CARES Act and how community development block grant monies will flow, and how to access those funds, and obviously that's critical for your work. The main focus of today is really going to be about state advocacy.
Muted.
The work that's being done by a number of networks that have really gotten us to a fine art of engaging with their legislatures and other institutions. We've got some of the top people in the country doing this kind of work to share with you what their lessons learned are. And the goal here is that we think that it's a real opportunity for all of you to be able to try to develop some kind of networks like this in states where you have them, or many of you have some part of that, and how to strengthen it. And that's our goal with this conversation. I think you'll all be pleased with it. And then we'll do the usual quick thing on membership, but talk a little bit about the next call before we leave. So with that, let's quickly pivot to,
Unmuted.
Melody, please give us the good news.
Thank you, Bruce. So this is a very exciting 2 weeks. We worked really hard with the House Financial Services Committee, House and Senate Appropriations, on trying to get housing counseling assistance in the now current stimulus package, because previously it was left out of other iterations. We are happy to report that I'm not sure what that noise was, but I'll roll with it. We're happy to report that House leadership introduced the HEROES Act. For all purposes, it's Stimulus 4.0, which includes a potential fourth wave of stimulus funding in response to the pandemic. I say potential because we're hearing different things on its likelihood of passing, but we're still very happy and optimistic. And thankfully, housing counseling assistance was funded at $100 million. With $8 million for administrative purposes. So thank you everyone for your advocacy. If you've talked to legislators or other stakeholders, working closely with us over the years on really pushing for housing counseling assistance being a priority in any sort of housing legislation. This wasn't just our work, it was the hard work of several years of really doing strong and focused advocacy. Another key point of the package that we're excited about that it includes, it allows for funds to be used for equipment and technology. So agencies have been talking to us and telling us that it's very, very difficult in this current landscape to provide counseling services with sort of outdated technology or equipment for mobile counseling, and we're happy that that's included. Next slide. So some background. Originally, NHRC and many of our partners in DC and around the country were advocating for $700 million. This was a number that was supported by Representative Axney, Democrat from Iowa, as well as House Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters. They were both very, very big advocates for the program, and they felt that it should be $700 million, similar to the National Foreclosure Mitigation Counseling Program from a decade ago out of the Great Recession. They wanted something similar in scale, given the scope of the pandemic, and many of the conversations being had around eviction and foreclosure counseling. We also wanted the program to be administered through NeighborWorks after several discussions with partners because of concerns that if the funds were given through HUD, that there might be a gap in time between receiving the funds and the funds going out to the door to agencies. Ultimately, the $100 million will be managed by the HUD Housing Counseling Program. Next slide. There were originally some concerns about that with the HUD program, but we're still very optimistic. We're still going to work closely with HUD and our partners on the Hill going forward with the program. We're happy that they're supportive. House Appropriations and House Financial Services have been our two biggest partners in this, and we're very, very thankful. As I said, Chairman Waters has said many times on many calls and proposals that housing counseling is one of our top housing priorities. And as I said in the call last week, having it one of the top priorities is how housing counseling got in the stimulus package, which was decided by House leadership and Speaker Pelosi. So that's very, very critical. In addition, House Appropriations, Transportation HUD Chairman Price from North Carolina and Ranking Member Diaz-Balart from Florida were also very supportive. They were the team that helped us get $60 million in the House T-HUD Appropriations Bill that ultimately passed the House. So going forward, focus will be on encouraging Senate champions to defend the program. We're still working on sort of an advocacy plan that ensures that our Senate champions are very much heard and very vocal about the program. Obviously, we struggled in the Senate for quite some time, not necessarily because people aren't supportive of housing counseling. Many people are very much supportive, both in appropriations as well as banking, but there's always conversations in the Senate about the exact number, and we're working on that, but we're optimistic, and we definitely have a game plan going forward. Next slide. So to pivot, this is something that sort of came out of the woodwork recently that we've been working on for a while and sort of got shelved because the office was originally looking for original co-sponsors. But I'm happy to report finally that the Housing Financial Literacy Act was introduced in the Senate by Senator Peters, Democrat from Michigan. We've talked about this bill for quite some time. This is the legislation that provides a 25-point discount to FHA mortgage insurance premiums for first-time home buyers who complete a financial education housing counseling program. The House version, HR 2162, passed the House, and it was introduced by Representatives Beatty and Stivers from Ohio, very much in support of this legislation, and it was also bipartisanly supported in the House. So we're really excited that it was finally introduced. Next slide. This was, I see it wasn't on the slide, but the original co-sponsor for the Senate version is Senator Cornyn from Texas. There's a few differences between the Senate version and the House version. The only real difference is that the Senate version does not include the requirements that we really worked with their office on, that counseling must be completed before signing a mortgage application or sales agreement. There's opportunity to sort of amend the language in a committee markup. However, we heard from Chairman Crapo in banking that he prefers bills go through markup if there is significant Republican support within his committee. Next slide. So we're really excited that Senator Cornyn has joined legislation because this will help us sort of advocate with Senate banking Republicans to support legislation. Senator Cornyn is not on the banking committee, but we think having his support will sort of help us with those discussions. But as I said previously, without Republican committee support in particular, it is very unlikely that this bill will move through committee. And it's also very unlikely that without significant support, it could be included in any potential Senate stimulus package. Now, the legislation will not be included, we believe, in the current stimulus package for the Senate, but there's always opportunities in the future. And I believe that's everything. Overall, we're just very excited for all the updates coming out of the Hill. Housing counseling is definitely part of the national housing conversation, and we're very proud of that work, and we'll continue to work hard to see it go through and hopefully pass so that agencies get the aid they need at this time.
Excellent. Now, I think it's a big breakthrough, and if you hear from Melody on asking for your support to engage with some of your senators, please act on this right away. This is critical work here, and we have got some hurdles to reach to get the $100 million into a final package, and there's many hurdles that are beyond our reach, but hopefully there'll be a solution to them in general. The key thing is for us to be put into that package as well. So I think we're well positioned in the House, but then it's going to be a challenge, and we'll want to do a fair amount of work there, and we'll reach out especially to groups that are with our key Republican voices in Kentucky and in Alabama, and we'll reach out to groups there. So please, you're certainly welcome to reach out to Melody directly if that's in your wheelhouse, in your geography. But all of this will be critical work, and we're pretty excited about being able to move this into closure. We're also in communication with HUD about how this money might be used most effectively, and as that proceeds, we'll be glad to communicate as well. And I'm still hearing, just on the favorite question, whenever you bring up HUD, about where are things at on certification and delaying the certification, that this is still, we're awaiting a decision, but I believe it's going to be favorable, and it's only a question of when it kind of clears through all the legal hurdles. But we shall see, and we'll keep you informed as soon as we know anything more. With that, let me turn it over to Ellie, who's going to manage the next section of our presentation around how to do statewide advocacy.
Thanks, Bruce. Hi, everybody. I'm going to just move right to Marianne Malijan-McFadden because she has a limited amount of time and a lot of really great information to give us. So, Marianne, take it away.
Thanks, Ellie. Can you guys all hear me okay?
We sure can.
Perfect. Thank you for the invitation to join you all today. I work at Enterprise Community Partners, where we lead advocacy at the federal, state, and local government for affordable housing and community development resources. So I'm going to touch briefly on the HUD funding in the CARES Act, and then talk in particular about the CDBG program, since I know it's of interest to you all, since it can and is used for housing counseling activities. So overall, we saw almost $13 billion in funding for HUD programs in the CARES Act. So that's $5 billion for the Community Development Block Grant, $4 billion for Emergency Solutions Grants, which are to address homelessness, and plussing up of other housing programs, including public housing programs like tenant-based and project-based rental assistance, public housing operating fund dollars for existing public housing units, 2 different grants for Native American programs, and funding for specialized programs for people with AIDS, the elderly, and people with disabilities, and then additional funding for fair housing enforcement. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the CDBG program, let me just give you a quick overview. CDBG funds are awarded by HUD by formula to all of the states, plus about 1,200 localities every year. And that's done by formula, and about 70% of the money goes to local governments, and then 30% is reserved to the states. The jurisdictions develop plans on how they're going to spend their money, do a citizen participation process where they seek public feedback for a minimum of 30 days, and they do hearings, and then they submit their plans to HUD. When using the money, 70% of the funds must primarily benefit people of modest means. So that means that the CDBG funds must primarily serve people making up to 80% of AMI. And really, it's a menu of options that jurisdictions have. Governments are the decision makers. They can spend their CDBG funds on infrastructure projects, on economic development grants and loans, and on a variety of housing activities, including housing counseling. They also can pay emergency assistance. So we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions coming forward now trying to create short-term project-based and tenant-based rental assistance until they can receive additional payments through the other housing programs that were funded. HUD has also given flexibility to jurisdictions for their fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 CDBG funds to make changes to the way they use their funds. So under the annual CDBG program, for most places, 15% of the funds can be used for what's called public services under the program, and that's grants to nonprofits. And that's one of the ways where housing counseling is eligible. Let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk about the CARES Act funding for the CDBG program. So HUD is calling this CDBG CV, so that's the coronavirus-related $5 billion that came under the CARES Act. You just heard from Melody about the HEROES Act in the House. That also includes a $5 billion supplemental funding appropriation for CDBG. So should that pass, we could see $10 billion in CDBG dollars to address coronavirus. I would emphasize what both she and Bruce said, which is that advocacy is critical for us to realize those dollars. So the House has seen the importance of funding housing in all of its forms. We are not seeing that level of appetite in the Senate, so very important to focus particularly on the Republicans, but all members of the Senate on the importance of housing funding. So under the CARES Act, the money is broken into 3 buckets. So HUD has already allocated 2 of the 3 tranches of funds. So the first was $2 billion in direct funding for states and localities, just using the current fiscal year CDBG program formula. They got that out the door very quickly. And then on May 11th, they put out an additional $1 billion allocation that goes to the states and also to the insular area, which is HUD speak for places like American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands. Puerto Rico is included as a state for this purpose, as well as the USVI. So this funding, unlike the annual funding, can be used anywhere inside of a state. So for this $1 billion, they can use it statewide. Under the regular program and under the first $2 billion tranche, states can only spend the money in areas that don't receive their own formula allocation. So if you recall, I said that there are 1,200 local jurisdictions nationwide that receive CDBG funds. Usually they can't receive a direct allocation from HUD and get funding from their state. But here there is an exception under the law. So this $1 billion you may see states making funding available for use in certain portions of the state or statewide, which of course is beneficial for nonprofits and others who are working across multiple jurisdictions. There is additionally $2 billion that can be allocated on a rolling basis. And here the Secretary of HUD will determine how and when to put that money by looking at coronavirus-related factors, including the impact of coronavirus on housing. No indication from HUD yet what data they're going to use to make that determination. So that's just a TBD how that last $1 billion will be allocated. Under the CARES Act, there's also $10 million for technical assistance and $10 million for HUD's own expenses. HUD got the ability to plus up existing technical assistance contracts, so serving jurisdictions right away. Housing counseling is an area where, for example, HUD could provide technical assistance. So if that's something that's important to you all, you might think about working with jurisdictions that are receiving funds, if you're not jurisdictions yourselves, to ask HUD to provide that kind of technical assistance for recipients of funds. Unlike the annual CDBG program, all of the $5 billion here is available with no caps on the amount that can be subgranted to nonprofits. So remember I said that there's generally a 15% cap. Here, Congress took that cap away. So there's no limit on the amount of funds that can be used for public services. HUD has additional ability to waive both regulations like it normally does, but also statutes. So to the extent that there are any activities that are not currently allowable, HUD can make them available to jurisdictions to carry out by creating what they call alternative requirements. So they waive whatever rule gets in the way and create an alternative requirement. However, I don't think that's as important for you all because housing activities are generally eligible under the CDBG program. So there's HUD guidance. For any of you who want to look, the regulations are at 24 CFR 570-201. And you could look at 201E, 201N, and 201K, but generally they allow housing counseling services. It can be as a public service, it can be a home ownership activity, or if you're working with a population that's served under the home program, it can be housing service for recipients of home. But again, we need to look at whether these activities are serving low and moderate income people so that the program can still meet that threshold that 70% of the funds are used to benefit low and moderate income people. And generally that means with housing counseling that 100% of the folks being counseled need to be low and moderate income. HUD determines that by looking at actual income and family size, or by allowing people to be categorized into certain groups that are presumed to be low and moderate income. So that would be, for example, battered spouses. Or people who are currently experiencing homelessness. So that is what I have prepared for you. I just note that jurisdictions locally have a waiver now that allows them to revise their 2019 and their 2020 CDBG plans without having to do 30 days of public comment. It's waived down to just 5 days, and they can do virtual public hearings, and that applies to the new CDBG CV money as well. So if you are not a jurisdiction and you want your jurisdiction to commit money to the activities that you care about, now is absolutely the time to reach out. Don't wait till the public comment period because it's going to go very quickly. With that, I'd be really happy to take questions.
That's really great. It's really, really great information, Marian. So I've a question that I would like to ask. As far as the public comments are concerned, how would you suggest that groups begin that initial outreach? Like, where should they start? If they don't know where to start, what's the best first step?
So the local governments and the state governments are really the ones holding the power. So mostly we're talking about activities that are already eligible, that that HUD has given rules to jurisdictions about how they can conduct them. So you don't have to dig as deep on the waivers. So first think about if an activity is already eligible, that the real work to be done is getting the jurisdiction to want to fund it. But if you are a jurisdiction and you want to do activities that have not been blessed by HUD, then you work with your local field office. And if you're not sure about whether an activity is eligible, HUD has set up a mailbox. It's CPD questions answered at HUD.gov. CPD questions answered at HUD.gov, and questions can be submitted to the mailbox. And HUD then will respond to the questioner directly and publish the answer on the website. HUD does seem to be hesitant to use its really broad waiver authority because they're trying to move quickly. They're trying to reduce the amount of conversations that they need to have with the White House to get on board with policy. So as sort of the best advice I could give would be try to squeeze what you want to do into an existing activity before asking for a waiver.
And just to understand this, just to understand this, so the housing counseling is an eligible activity already, and we don't need to go through those. Is that also true if the city or whatever the locality is has not funded housing counseling before? Can we still go in and just say, this is what we'd like to see? And then is it that we go to the city housing department? Do we go to the mayor's office? Do we go to city council? How does that work?
Yes, so if you're a community that receives CDBG, so that's generally going to be the Housing and Community Development Department, but it does vary. It could be Labor, Economic Development, Small Business Department, occasionally a public housing agency. So you'd want to find out who that implementer is locally. And of course, never hurts to just go to the top and go to your mayor or your governor's office as well. And say to them, this is already an activity, so you don't need to get permission from HUD. There are trainings available online to understand how to comply with HUD's rules. So it should be a fairly easy ask to make of them, even if they're not aware, if they haven't been doing it already.
Hi, this is Melody. What will be the channel of distribution for these funds? So, for example, will it be provided and distributed through the state-operated housing finance agencies or another source?
So the state gets to determine. So the state is going to be working two different ways, right? So for most of their money, they're going to be working in non-entitlement areas. So those are those places that are not receiving the funding directly, and they're just going to push the money to them. And they can set some parameters about how they want the funds to be used, but then they'll be administered by counties or cities or towns. However, HUD could potentially issue a waiver to allow the states to fund nonprofits directly. HUD routinely does that with disaster grants after natural disasters, but TBD whether HUD's going to do that now with this funding. They haven't done it yet. And then there are going to be state funds that the states can use in localities, can push to localities as well. But until they get that waiver, the state can't give the funds directly to nonprofits. But once those funds are in the hands of local governments, whether directly from HUD or from the state, then they get to make the decision about how they're going to make funds available. They can do competitive procurement and contracting, or they can do non-competitive awards to nonprofits. So
what about organizational?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I interrupted you. My mistake.
I just was going to say that setting up those relationships with the agencies that administer the funds is really important. So making sure that if you're a nonprofit, that they know who you are, they understand your expertise in providing housing counseling, and they understand what value it can provide in this post-COVID setting.
Thank you. What about organizational partnerships? Are they able to apply for said funding?
Yes, there will need to be a lead applicant in most instances that would then be responsible for administering the funds to the other nonprofits. So that would mean ensuring that the other nonprofits have the capacity to administer the funds and being the one that's checking on them over the course of the grant administration if they receive funding. And then it also means that if one of the subrecipients breaks a rule and HUD finds out and demands repayment, that lead applicant would be on the hook. So they would want to have a subrecipient agreement passing down that liability. But yes,
so
HUD does allow grants to multiple organizations.
So would you say the first step is for organizational partnerships to approach the governor to ask the state to apply for a waiver to subgrant directly to nonprofits, or would you suggest another path of action?
So I know that HUD has multiple waiver requests in already for that, and HUD does generally respond when they get even more. So yes, asking your governor's office to apply for that waiver would be a good thing. And again, that would just give the state the ability to give funds to nonprofits directly. It wouldn't compel them to, right? So they would still have the discretion to award their funds in part or in whole to governmental entities. So there's kind of no harm in asking at this point if you're the governor's office.
Great, thank you.
So is that all of our questions then, Melody?
No, I guess the only other question I see here is what would you consider technical, but they haven't fleshed that out.
If they're referring to the technical assistance, that's the technical assistance monies.
Sure, so technical assistance is HUD speak for national experts in HUD programs who can work with the recipients of the funds to understand how to make best use of those funds. So I work at Enterprise Community Partners. We're one of many technical assistance providers for HUD, and we have specialties that we work with communities to understand. So for example, HUD will send us to communities that are in financial distress to help them have strategies around how they run their budgets. They will send us into post-disaster locations to help them think through the use of CDBG in combination with FEMA funds or other things. There's a cadre of experts that you can call upon. So HUD will decide which experts to send in depending on what communities need help with or asking for help with. I understand HUD is looking at the possibility of providing some national technical assistance, not just one-on-one with a jurisdiction, but using some of that money to help jurisdictions understand the multiplicity of things they can do. So one thing that you could do in working with your jurisdictions is say to them, it might be helpful if you ask HUD to provide you guidance on the best way to do housing counseling. And then HUD would hire an expert in housing counseling.
Someone just asked that their local entity is distributing funds through a competitive application, and they wanted to know if they were, if this was allowed.
Yes, absolutely. The jurisdictions have their choice of methods. And some places we see that state law or city law will require competitive bids in all cases, except for emergency, which sometimes you would think COVID situation will qualify, but sometimes it doesn't qualify to get around those competitive bid requirements.
Thanks. That's it on questions for now.
Great, thank you.
Great, and if folks have questions after the fact, I can be reached at mmcfadden@enterprisecommunity.org, and always happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I know that you have to jump off because your expertise is in high demand, and we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today to explain this.
Really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So with that, we are going to move on to our next panelist, Kirsten Keefe, who is the Senior Staff Attorney and Director of the HOP Anchor Partner Program and at Empire Justice Center, and HOP is the Home Ownership Protection Program. Kirsten.
Great, thanks so much for having me. You can go to the first slide, please. I'm really happy to be with everyone today. And also Christy Peel is on, I believe, from the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. So we've worked collectively on trying to get funding in New York State for foreclosure prevention services, namely housing counseling and legal services around the state. So the first slide is just a history of the funding in New York State. So we first started getting, this is a dedicated stream of funding that we get to provide foreclosure prevention services. It started in 2008. And it's a unique stream of funding because the funding goes to both housing counseling as well as legal services programs. So, you know, and that really happened because early on, when we were first asked back in 2008, it was Hillary Lamishaw with TRIP, which is a housing counseling organization, and she and I were working together, and we attended a Banks Committee meeting, and somebody asked her, what do you think is needed? And we said, funding for housing counseling and legal services. And so we got a first allocation of about $25 million that went to our state housing finance agency. Hillary and I worked together with them in developing a program, and we recognized the symbiotic relationship in this area for housing counseling and legal services. So we tied them together, and they have been married since then, in a very good relationship, I will say, over the years. So this is just the history of it. You know, we had 2 years of state funding, and then we were in a big legislative campaign to seek more funding in 2012. And then the National Mortgage Servicing Settlement came down, and New York State was set to get a lot of cash dollars coming in. So we advocated with the New York State Office of the Attorney General to dedicate some of the funding that he was getting at that point in time in cash, and he did, but the program was moved from the state agency to the Office of the Attorney General. So we have sputtered along all these years with about $20 million each year dedicated to foreclosure prevention services, and the program has continued with the New York State Office of the Attorney General. I should just note, and Ellie, you can go on to the next slide, please. But although the first time we got this funding, it was just simply because we said this is what we need. I will say since then, and not exactly yearly, but now it has been more annually for the last 4 or 5 years, we have undergone a major statewide campaign to get more money. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm just the first person of a couple people who are going to talk about state advocacy efforts, and it is always specific to your state and what's going on. So I'm going to talk in general principles, and I think folks will bring in new points and emphasize some of the keys that have worked in New York State. So Ellie asked me to start from the beginning and where to begin, especially if you've never done sort of state level advocacy. So the biggest thing is to always try to find a champion. You know, we had a champion that first year who was willing to listen to what we thought the state needed. But if you are sort of starting with a blank slate, I would certainly look to the chairs of your respective housing, banking, judiciary, consumer protection committees, any other related committees that your state legislature might have. Look at the committee membership. And then you also want to look at, you know, who are your members, who you might have relationships with or could develop relationships pretty easily. Look at members' districts who are particularly impacted. So in New York State, of course, we're always looking at New York City members as well as folks on Long Island, where we have foreclosure statewide, of course, like every state, but obviously the numbers are particularly dense in New York City and on Long Island. We've also, you know, wanted to target members who are in swing districts, whose caucuses want to help them out and make sure that they get reelected. And this is certainly an issue that is responsive to the needs of their constituents. So there are a number of different ways you can try to identify and start to develop relationships with folks who might end up being a champion. Secondly, really know the politics, plus the process and the procedures of your state legislature. So my organization, Empire Justice Center, we do lobbying. We have a history of working in Albany, so we know the players, although we're always working with other lobbyists as well. But you really have to know, a grassroots advocacy effort is definitely key, but you also need to know people who know people to get things done. And then I just put in at the end, know what you and others can do around lobbying. So I think that there is a little bit of a misunderstanding of how much nonprofits can do for lobbying. And I think some groups we found can actually do more than what they thought they could, especially if it's around funding for their own programs. The LSC programs, the legal services programs, are prohibited from lobbying in the country unless it is related to funding for themselves. So we've really been able to engage a lot of those offices in our statewide effort around lobbying as well. And then we also got an exemption from the grants that we get, which otherwise prohibit, that our grantees get, that otherwise prohibit us from lobbying under the program at the AG's office called HOP. And we got an exemption to allow folks to lobby. Ellie, you can go to the next slide, please. So connecting with others, I think this is a theme that will be emphasized by everybody. But, you know, build a campaign or a coalition in your state. In New York State, we do have a consumer advocacy coalition, New Yorkers for Responsible Lending, and we have a very active mortgage work group. We actually created a separate campaign for the foreclosure funding because it is such a big animal in and of itself. But it runs very much in concert with our existing statewide coalition. But you really want to get widespread representation. We have the Housing, Counseling, and Legal Services programs from across the state as part of that campaign. You definitely want to try to align yourself with influential organizations. So AARP in New York State is very influential, as I imagine they are probably with every state legislature. And we have a very good existing relationship with AARP, and they've been extremely helpful, even though they don't get any of the grant dollars to provide the direct services. They certainly understand how their members benefit from the services, and they really care about it. So it's really, you know, important to also ally yourself with big state players like that. Other stakeholders, we talked to our conference of mayors. And then otherwise, it's just coalition building. You know, it's good to come up with the name of the campaign, create a good logo. You know, we have a separate listserv. I think Ellie was also I sent around a 2-pager as an example of materials that we produced, but that has our logo and our campaign on it, our campaign name. The next slide.
Those, just so you know, they are available as a handout in the chat box.
Okay, great. Okay,
and I'll just let people know I'm sorry, Kirsten, I keep interrupting you. I'll just let people know if you're not able to download and print it out, as well as not being able to download and print out the PowerPoint, I'll include all of these things in the email that comes out afterwards with the recording.
So the next slide is just really, you know, basic, obvious information, but a reminder to be seen and be heard. You have to get out there. Decisions are made by people who show up. You know, again, we just happened to show up at this meeting when we were asked what we needed, and that's how this whole ball got rolling. So it's really important to get out there. At this point in time, we have 87 organizations, nonprofits, again, including the Housing, Counseling, and Legal Services statewide, who are currently receiving this funding. And we've been doing these funding campaigns for so long now that I think every organization at this point in time has a good relationship with in New York State, we have an assembly as well as our Senate, so with their members' offices. And they do in-district meetings, which are really helpful because often you can meet directly with the member themselves. And you can also often have more time to discuss. It's also easier to bring clients in, and it's always great to bring clients in to talk directly with the members if possible. But it's also important to come and have meetings in the state capitol, because the state capitol, what we find in Albany or in New York State, is that the Albany staffers tend to be the ones who are working more directly on the budget issues. So it's really important to connect and make those relationships as well with the members' offices in our state capitol. We also do at least one big lobby day every year. The last couple of years, we've done a couple of Albany days where we have, 60 to 100 people coming in from across the state, and we have a big lobby day. I would encourage folks to meet also with their state agencies and regulators. So over the years, we've also developed relationships with our state housing agency as well as our state version of the banking department. It's called the Department of Financial Services in New York State. So we've gone to them for support and also built relationships so they can help us craft the message and figure out what message might resonate in any particular year as when we're trying to lobby for further funding every year. And then again, just show up at hearings, town halls, events that the members might have in your district. Definitely know that that you are in their communities, primarily so they can refer constituents to you. But also, you want to let them know how many people you're serving every year and what services you provide, and remind them that you exist and they know the importance of your services. Let me just pause and see, Christy, if you want to jump in anywhere before we go to the next one.
Well, I think you're probably going to go into this a little bit, but part of our strategy was working with individual organizations and local media outlets to really highlight local impact in a way that could capture the huge variety of need and impact across the state. So again, we were working in New York, and we had and we have groups from Buffalo all the way to the end of Long Island. So there's a lot of variability in the terms of the issues and the interventions, and the fact that sometimes we were working with legal services partners and sometimes we were working with housing counseling partners. So being able to capture the local impact is really important, while we're also talking about the collective impact across the state.
Yeah, great point. And Ellie, can we go ahead to the next slide, and then we can come back to this one? Because I think the next slide is on media. Let's just stick on that, yeah. And actually, Christy's organization got some work assistance through a public relations firm that was really helpful. We've been doing, and we're all nonprofits, and we've been doing our own media over the years, and trying to do our own communications. But it's been very helpful to have their professional, both technical assistance, but also they have connections with media outlets that we just don't have. So it's been really helpful working with them. And one of the great things, in addition to just media stories about individuals, and the Center for New York City Neighborhoods has also started banking client stories. So we try to keep client stories throughout the year with information about whether or not a particular client would be willing to talk to the media. So when we hit a hot moment on having to lobby for funding, we know, and if we get a media request, or if we think that we need to get a story placed in a particular member's district, we can go to the story bank that the Center for New York City Neighborhoods has developed and say, okay, we have client X in that county, it's in this person's district, and we can feed it to a news story. The other thing that I'll just add is the op-eds. So we got very lucky this year and got a couple of key op-eds placed, and they were op-eds that we tended to draft, we being the advocates, but then we worked with members, the chair of our House or our Senate Housing Committee, for example, to author or co-author the op-ed, and they, it's an easy thing for them to put their name on an issue and get their name out there, and it's a great way to get media attention. And then let's just go back to the, go ahead.
On the op-eds, it's a great opportunity for collaboration, because you could have the op-ed, the structure of the op-ed done and get everybody to feed into kind of the basic bones of it. And then when you see a need to go to a certain market, you can identify a local author, plug in some really specific local statistics, and move really quickly. So it was a great way for both the steering committee to collaborate, and we definitely got better at this over the a series of several campaigns. And then again, have key partners and electeds, as Kirsten said, ready to go right away in those local markets.
Great. And then Ellie, we can just go back to the prior slide about put it in writing. So, every state, I think, is probably different about what is the norm for submitting. In New York State, we have memos of opposition or memos of support for legislation that's going forward. We also do sign-on letters. We do letters to our governor. And we've created a lot of one-pagers or two-pagers. So again, I did give Ellie one two-pager that we had done for this last campaign to give you a sense. You can see our logo and the campaign name that we developed, and then it's just a basic two-page fact page on the Homeowner Protection Program, which is our statewide program. And then New York State likes to have a lot of hearings. So we always try to provide written testimony. We try to we try to testify in person, but if we can't testify in person, we always try to provide written testimony. You know, so one, you want to make sure that they know you are there, what you're all about, the services that you provide. You have to tell the legislature. They will not know that inherently, typically. But you also want them to start to know you as a person of expertise for not only, you know, for more funding, but also other foreclosure issues. So the more that you can get your name out there, or your campaign's name out there, you know, obviously the more you get known. And then I'll just end on the last piece, the power of reports and white papers and data and stories. You know, we end every meeting that we have in the legislature with, you know, is there any more information we can provide you? They often say, yes, we would love information on the economic impact of foreclosures on New York State, or we would love to know how many people in our district are delinquent or whatever. So we're very careful to, you know, always ask that question, write down what they need, and to always follow up, because again, I think a lot of people don't necessarily follow up with them. So, you know, just building your integrity within the offices of the members. And then also, again, building yourself up as a place of expertise. So we had done an economic impact analysis of foreclosures in New York State. And I provided that to Ellie. It was a 2 to 3 page document. It was a lot of work, and I'll just say specifically on that, if anybody is looking to do the economic impact in your state, feel free to reach out to me, because I did a lot of research on how to calculate it. So I'll just say that aside. But anyway, I would just really recommend, you know, the power of doing research like that and putting that out there, you know, is incredible. So I think that's all the slides, and I think you're going to hold off for questions until everybody goes, right, Ellie?
We are going to hold off. And thank you again for taking the time to be with us. I know, Kirsten, that you need to hop off, but Christy has agreed to stay on to answer questions. I am going to let everybody know that I'm going to pause the screen, because we are going to alter the order of our presenters, because as in coronavirus fashion, one of our presenters has an emergency meeting coming up that makes him need to leave our call earlier. So we're going to go to him first. So give me a moment while I get to the next slides for him. Okay. So Samuel Gunter is the Executive Director of North Carolina Housing Coalition, and he's going to talk with us about what they've been doing in North Carolina, and with a little bit of a focus on some political changes that happened that had a big impact on them. So go ahead, Samuel. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Perfect. All right, thank you, and I apologize again for having to jump ahead in the line. Part of what's happening right now is we are in the middle of a short session, and our bill drafting deadline is tomorrow, and so we're trying to get a bill for $100 million of foreclosure assistance and $100 million of rental and utility assistance filed, and get some leadership support on the Republican side in the House. So I just got a call from one of the chairmen that they want to go over some of the details. So that's why I'm going to need to jump up early, which is sort of beginning at the end. So I want to take a step back and kind of narrate from a 30,000-foot view over the last decade and a half or so, sort of what's happened in North Carolina. Before the foreclosure crisis, we because of the closure of a couple of major employers, there was a broad effort among, you know, the crowd that the previous presenters were talking about, right? It's legal services. It's a lot of the folks who care about consumer protections. Center for Responsible Lending is here in North Carolina. So it's a universe of housing counseling agencies, legal services folks, just general consumer advocates, advocates for low-income communities. came together and developed this foreclosure prevention program before the foreclosure crisis. So once that happened, we had some infrastructure to layer on top of. This was also combined, as our presenter from Enterprise Community Partners was talking about with CDBG. We had a state-funded ecosystem of locally embedded organizations that did long-term community development, and they were connected to a state infrastructure, and they were sustained by state appropriation, by the allocation of the CDBG funding, in the non-entitlement CDBG funding that the state controlled, as well as the home funding that went through the finance agency. And so these alternating grant cycles allowed larger community development organizations that did affordable housing development, that did housing counseling, that did a number of small business development, a number of different things spread out across the state to sustain. So kind of Hurricane Floyd hits North Carolina in 1999. It's that network of organizations connected to a state infrastructure that knew how to do long-term community development and the grant reporting and all of that connected to it that served as the main body of organizations that responded in the medium and the long term to the recovery needs. In 2010, we had a political earthquake in North Carolina. For the first time since Reconstruction, Republicans took over control of both chambers of our General Assembly. And this shifted the dynamic immensely. Some of the perception of that network was that it was a Democratic Party slush fund, and which led ultimately to the zeroing out of the state support for that network, in addition to the movement of the state CDBG allocation over to our Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and now Environmental Quality, to do water infrastructure projects. And so this whole ecosystem of state and federal funding that used to be dedicated to housing development, to housing counseling services, to a number of different things disappeared. And that network of community development corporations was gutted. And it has been, I cannot overstate the impact of that. So the election, kind of the big election is in 2010. The gutting of that network happens in 2013. And so folks trying to figure out how to survive, we had some folks get creative, but a lot of organizations, especially in some smaller rural areas, fell by the wayside. The folks in state government, they all moved on to other things. So fast forward to Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence. CDBG, disaster recovery, is the vehicle that disaster recovery goes out. So when Matthew hits, this network that formed the backbone of the response in 1999 mostly doesn't exist anymore. And the state agency that ran all of it doesn't do CDBG anymore. And so we spend 2.5 years trying to, we created a whole new state agency to be able to do this. And the conversations are still happening right now about how best to deploy that money. So that's a little bit of context for where we're at in the state. And in that, I want to kind of talk about the ways in which we do advocacy and the impact kind of within that arc. So a couple of years ago, we were trying to figure out a different way to get funding out to housing counseling agencies and other folks who do kind of creative community and affordable housing development around the state. And one of the things that we were looking at that we thought might be possible in our political climate here was an opportunity tax credit based off of a community development tax credit based off of what they have in South Carolina, which is a state credit that is investments that are made to agencies that are deemed eligible by the state. Those investments you can get a tax credit on them, right? Which it drives investment into some affordable housing and community development organizations. I will say we almost got that over the line solely by saying South Carolina has that. How come North Carolina doesn't have that? You would not believe how convincing that was for a great deal of legislators in our General Assembly. Of course, we didn't get it over the line. And one of the reasons we didn't get it over the line was the chairman of one of the significant committees that would have heard any kind of tax-related item had a bad experience with his local housing counseling agency. He's in the mortgage business. The agency at some point, they had, I don't know what it was, but that they had some kind of run-in. And the question I got straight up was, would this organization see any of this money? Because if they would, my answer is no. And that was the gatekeeper for getting this legislation passed. So fast forward to this morning, we are working on this foreclosure prevention money, this rental assistance, utility assistance, as well as support for housing counseling agencies. And this individual is still in that role. And it's still the gatekeeper on anything that's going to be able to go through on that front. Because of that interaction several years ago, we did some work with our network to begin to tell them to develop relationships and in some cases repair relationships with the elected officials in their area, the state elected officials in their area. So this morning, we jump on a call with this chairman as well as two other chairmen of other committees that are handling this. And not only had that dynamic completely shifted, he was the one that suggested that instead of some of this money going out in another avenue, that really the best people to be able to do this are housing counselors and housing counseling agencies, and talked about the good work that they're doing at this agency, which was a complete 180 from the attitude he had of that organization 2 years prior, when they were the kind of poster of what he didn't want. And so some of the ways that we have done that, we have encouraged all of our members, and I'll take a step back here. We're a big tent organization. And so we've got everyone from emergency shelter providers to housing counseling agencies, habitat affiliates, for-profit and nonprofit low-income housing tax credit developers, the banks that invest in them, units of local government that do community development and affordable housing. We have a big tent of folks that are part of our coalition. It is a little unwieldy at times, keeping all of those people in the same tent. It's incredibly hard because everyone has a little bit different interest in, especially when it comes to limited resources. But the benefit of that is that when I'm bringing, say, I don't know, a member of our coalition that represents a piece that this member may not appreciate, I'm also bringing someone who might take a part of this continuum that they do. So, you know, if this legislator is not a fan of housing counselors, I can also bring a tax credit developer in with me, or vice versa, right? So we keep our strength together. Is a big part of how we do this. And so in the General Assembly, we rely heavily on our expertise, right? So this research that the previous presenter was talking about, we create county profiles of affordability need so that we're able to articulate in every county in North Carolina, what does this need look like? How many cost burden renters are we talking about? How many evictions were filed? And so forth. The big challenge, and I would love, and I am absolutely going to follow up, is the economic impact. We've had a harder time getting good numbers that folks believe and get excited about on that end. But essentially, I end every meeting I have with an elected official with, here's my card. If you have any questions, I can get you the answer. I know the person who has the answer, right? And so we rely heavily in the General Assembly on our expertise and being able to connect them with the folks in their district who are doing this work and know the answer, right? And so that's a lot that we rely on. And in that, we are nonpartisan. We work very closely with folks on both sides of the aisle. And you know, because of the breadth of our coalition, we also have folks in our membership who are, you know, active on both sides of the aisle, which helps for our access. I would also say we hire a lobbyist. That has been incredibly important for us, especially as the political climate shifted. What we found in North Carolina, the environment was pretty toxic for a while. you know, I would point to, if anyone ever wants to kind of run down the rabbit hole, since we all have so much time now, that's sarcastic. Mappingtheleft.com, we had a conservative group try and map the vast left-wing conspiracy in North Carolina. And if you know, are connected to, have given money to, are on the board of, or on the staff of any of these organizations that they deem are part of this, you're searchable on this database that they've created. And for a couple of sessions, if you were on that database, you really couldn't get meetings with Republican leadership. It was rough out there. And so in that progressive advocacy space, we were sort of unique, even though I show up there. You know, they pulled my Facebook picture and my wife's on there and we're linked as Mary. I mean, it's really intense. One of the ways we were still able to get access, in part because we had crafted this broad coalition. And so even though we were in this like list of, you know, no visits, we were still able to overcome that and get that, in part because, you know, we have this broad coalition, and what we relied on and continue to rely on is our expertise. Right. So we're giving them, you know, here's what's happening in your district. The folks that are on the front lines and are seeing this on a day-to-day basis, we're providing them with that information, connecting to the folks that, if they're looking for stories, and I love the idea of a banking stories, and I'm excited to begin to think about how to do that more creatively. And so that's been, so we rely on our expertise, we develop resources, and we connect them to folks in their district, or folks around the country who can answer the question that they're asking. We hire a lobbyist so that we can do something that other advocates that are may not be able to do, which is pull people off the floor during a vote. You know, and we very, very intentionally hired a firm that had both Republican and Democratic folks as part of it. And that's been a very positive experience. And what we have seen over the last 3 years is that several of our allies in this work who, instead of hiring lobbyists, they hired full-time policy people, have realized that that is insufficient, particularly in our climate. And so we've seen kind of a number of our allies also go that route of hiring lobbyists as well, to kind of get that little extra push across the finish line. Because the other thing we've seen in this political climate is that most of the work that is done happens in the offices of 3 or 4, maybe 5 legislators, and that's it. And so unless you can get to those folks, your ability to get to, you know, folks in the Democratic caucus or folks in the whatever, it's been, it's not as helpful. And so unless you can find a way in to the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker's office, the rules chair in both the Senate and the House, or one of the chairs of appropriations, that's really, without that access, it gets really hard. And so that's been key for us. The thing that we're working on now, and I'll say a little bit about this, and then I'll stop. The thing that we're working on now, and the thing that we've realized after a decade of this particular political dynamic, is that we can, while we saw that the stuff that we cared about and were working on didn't see the same kind of, we still saw drastic cuts, but there were other folks that went completely away. We were still able to keep things, our state's affordable housing trust fund, we had a loss of the state housing tax credit. It was changed to a loan program. You know, it was significantly decreased, but it still existed. There was still, you know, we have a good finance agency. We still had strong relationships there. But one of the things that we've realized after a decade of this dynamic is that while we didn't see as much drastic cuts as some of the stuff some of our other allies cared about, because they didn't craft this broad coalition, what we have seen though is that we're also unable, or not also, but even though we were able to stave off some of that on the cut front, we're not able to move anything in a significant way without, by relying on that expertise. right? That will allow us to be able to get messages in, to be able to, they're wanting to craft a bill and they're going to do this horrible thing, and or whether it's intended or unintended, and we're able to say, well, no, here's because they trust that expertise voice, that we're not in there to try and figure out how we can run an ad against them later. What we are realizing now is that without some kind of power base, that expertise can only get you so far. And so what we're trying to figure out now is how to better rely on our network, not just as a source of stories, as a source of reliable local folks that we bring in with us to visit, to be able to craft a state, but use them as mobilization points, right? So our job in the General Assembly is to make sure that we know the right levers to pull, the right folks to talk to, and when things are happening. And this network that we've developed, that they then become, we want them, right? We want their expertise and the work that they do and their voice and their stories. But beyond that, what we really want is their board members and their volunteers and their donors and their partner families and their on and on and on down the line, right? Like I said, we're a broad coalition of folks. We've got Habitat affiliates, and I think Habitat Wake, just one Habitat affiliate in one county, Raleigh, North Carolina, here in North Carolina, in 1 year, they have 50,000 people cycle through their organization, either as a resource shopper, a donor, a volunteer. We've got low-income housing tax credit properties that have folks living in them. And so what we're working on now is figuring out how can we play this mobilization role. And when you think about political impact down the road, and you think about the work we do in housing, every person, any organization in our coalition touches is at a moment where they need to update their registration to vote because they're moving, right? Whether it's homeownership, whether it's rental, everyone's moving. That's why they're touching a lot of our organizations. And it becomes this place to be able to do voter registration, a place to do mobilization in creative ways. And so some of the stuff that we're working on, ways that we can build power to be able to shift the conversation outside of the General Assembly so that when they come to the General Assembly, it's higher up on the agenda. The other piece that we're working on, and this is in response to COVID, and after this, I'll be done. So the CARES Act, as well as the CDBG disaster recovery money. Well, I'll leave that aside. The CARES Act piece. Talked about the entitlement versus the non-entitlement. So one of the other things, and the person at Enterprise was saying, for housing counseling agencies in particular, it's not that important to be able to push for these exceptions because housing counseling is already an allowable expense under CDBG. While that is true, what we see is that because this special CDBG money can be used for a wide variety of things, it is going to be incredibly tempting for local governments to use it to plug budget holes. And so it is going to take a lot of local advocacy. North Carolina has 28 entitlement communities. It's going to take a lot of advocacy in each of those 28 communities to make sure that those resources to the greatest extent possible are used for housing. To that end, we've developed talking points and one-pagers on that for local governments, as well as for all of our members in those entitlement areas. And after the call that I have, I've got to jump off early on the state front. My policy director and I are doing another call with other advocacy groups around the state. And these are local political action groups that have formed. They're not housing related. They're just local groups that are building power, a grassroots power, and are interested in moving. And what we often find in that space is, people who they want to shift systems, right? They have a systems mindset. They've got a grassroots organizing mindset, but they're often not the ones in the weeds on the grants and how all of this is working out, right? And so, as we're thinking about this power building piece long term, in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're relying on the folks that are doing that work on a regular basis, that what they do is voter mobilization. What they do is showing up in mass at local hearings and things like that. But they don't necessarily always know what the right right time to push or the right lever or the, to get the desired result. And so what we're trying to do is, as much as possible, develop relationships with those organizations so that we can be a trusted partner for them as well, in knowing that if what you want is rental and mortgage assistance funding, that is possible in this CARES Act funding, but you got to work for it. And here are the ways that they can do it. And if you get pushback on X, this is the, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the other piece that we're working on right now. I said I was going to say something about the disaster recovery money. We got $500 million, a little bit more than $500 million for Florence CDBG-DR funding. One of the roles that we have played, the governor, because of the relationships we developed in the General Assembly as well as the governor's office, the governor appointed us to chair the housing recovery support function of the state's disaster recovery task force, which is advising this new state agency on how to deploy that money and making sure some of that funding went to housing counseling agencies, particularly in buyout zones, is a major part of that work. We've got actually a call tomorrow on how to design that so that it gets out to the right folks in the way they can use it. So relationships are important. All of this happens because we're in the room, and we are in regular communication with our folks, and folks are in rooms that we can't be in, and just following up, building a broad coalition, making sure that we're showing up where we need to. So with that, I'll yield time if there are any questions.
Thanks, Samuel. We are going to wait until the end for questions. I know that you have to go, and so if there's any questions that come up specifically for you, I will interact with you on those. But please do send me a copy, if you don't mind, of your talking points that you use and the information that you're providing around the CDBG grants. I think that many of the groups would find that useful, especially those who maybe aren't used to doing that kind of advocacy.
Absolutely.
Great. So
and you
with that,
and you can find all of that. Sorry, and you can find all of that, including our county profiles and everything I talked about, on our website, nchousing.org. It's all right there, but I'll send it out as well.
Great, thank you. So with that, I am going to pause the screen again to save everybody's eyes as I quickly scroll back to the beginning of the presentation for the next presenter. Here we go.
So
Great.
Ellie, while you're looking for the slides and getting it up on screen, I will just jump right in to keep us moving along. How's that?
Well, I'm all set for you. This is Sharon Barker, who is the Vice President and COO of Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey. Go for it, Sharon.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to offer something up. So don't log off. I'm offering up something free at the end of the presentation, so you'll want to stay on. I'm going to try and give you some tools that you can use. That picture that was on the first slide, by the way, was the very last day that we were in the office in New Jersey before we all started our work at home. So that was March 11th. And I've kept that picture. I'm using it for everything to remind people that even though we can't be together physically, we can be together with our voices, with our messaging, and obviously virtually. So I'm from the Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey, and we've got about 250 member organizations. We've been around for 30 years, and we've been through several disasters, and we are working obviously in this one. A lot of the information in my slides are just there for you if you want to use them later, or that if someone wants to go through the presentation, they can and use it. I have done this presentation, or this type of presentation, on how to prepare for advocacy and for nonprofits that are not necessarily advocates or lobbyists to know what to do and how to go about it from a very basic point of view. But I've got some examples for you today, and then also what are we doing in New Jersey to address the COVID-19 issue, and how are we working through our legislature to get there. So if you want to change slides, please, Ellie. We also in New Jersey, we are the largest HUD-funded housing counseling intermediary for the state. And so that gives us a little bit of leverage and an opportunity to bring people together around an issue that people say, oh, they know what they're doing, they're certified, they're working together, and it really does help give a stronger voice when you can bring people that they can recognize that there is some importance to the work that's being done and that you have been approved through somewhere else. So the slide here is just on what is advocacy. And I think people get a little hung up on the lobby piece. And so when you're talking about advocacy, all you're really doing is trying to get someone to understand your point of view. You're trying to use facts, you're using relationships, you're using messaging, you're using whatever resources you have to get your point across. So if you think of it that way, it's not such a scary thing to do. In this case, for us, we really focus on educating the government officials and the public, maybe some other organizations, but that's really all you're doing. So just like when you're talking to one of your kids and you're trying to talk them into doing something, you use facts, you use whatever you can, you use the leverage. Obviously, we don't want to use any bribery, but that's what you're doing. You're trying to get people to understand your point of view. So if you would change the slide. So advocacy for us, and one of the things I really want to focus on here is a couple things. So one is, how do you do it? And that's what I was saying. You're trying to bring things together, media campaigns, the right people, public speaking, commissioning and publishing research. That's a big one. That's why we have a couple of reports attached here, and so do the others. A 501c3 organization, we get them all the time that say to us, we can't be part of your lobby day because we can't lobby as a 501c3. That's wrong. Unless you are very specific, as Kirsten said earlier, with certain situations, because the legal situation, they can't. But most 501c3 organizations, and I would say that's 99% of them, can lobby. That's what you do. You're there for a reason. You want to get your point across. So you can lobby, you can talk to your legislators, and you should. Up to about 30, I think it's 30% is the percentage of your time that can be spent on this without you having to register as a lobbyist. Now, two little facts, and if you ever are playing there's one version of Trivial Pursuit that I saw that has this question, so I'm going to give you an answer right now. Do you know where the term lobbying came from? New Jersey. And the term came from the fact that in New Jersey, our state house does not have offices for the elected officials. So they used to meet in the lobby. And that's where the term started. So all it started out as is, if you wanted to meet with an elected official in Trenton, which is our state capital, you met in the lobby. So keep that in your mind. That's the idea of what it is. You're talking to someone, you're trying to get them to understand your point of view and hopefully vote or fund you or whatever it may be with your point of view. The other thing I want to say is that we were in a lobbying session where we had about 250 of our members were all at the State House. And one of the things that came up was that we're sitting in one of the sessions, they're having a hearing, and the chair of the session said, why do you call this lobby day? It's legislative day. You're here to talk to legislators. You want to change legislation. So we have changed our terminology to be legislative day. And when we did that, some of the other organizations said, oh, okay, that makes more sense. We're not doing lobbying, and that means we can participate. Would you go to the next slide, please? So again, you're looking for whatever your problem or your issue is. You want to bring it together. You want to have a platform. You want to have a plan. Yeah, I'm big on to-do lists. I'm big on writing things down. And you just really step through it logically. And if you have a 3-year-old, or you've ever had a 3-year-old, or you've babysat, when they keep asking why, well, that's what you do when you're putting your messaging together around bringing forth your program. Why do we need it? Why do we want it? Why does it have to happen now? Go through all your whys until you have your answers. And then you're prepared for your presentation. The next one, please, Ellie. So advocacy steps, once you've identified what your goal is and you have a plan or a strategy, you're messaging and you're educating people. And in our case, let me give you some examples. So it really does matter who's in leadership. And I think most of us know that. But you have a different approach. You have different relationships depending on who's in leadership. So in 2012, Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast very hard. New Jersey got slammed. And we had a governor at the time who was setting himself up to run for president, Governor Christie. So his work with responding to some of the areas was not as, now because this is being recorded, I'm being very careful what I say, was not as proactive, or as even in its approach to the residents of the state as what we have right now with Governor Murphy, who's in during this pandemic. Now, Governor Murphy is more progressive and has already done things on making sure there's an eviction moratorium and that we have no foreclosures taking place right now and that the forbearance goes to the end of the mortgage. So all of these things are happening already and have been addressed right away. No one can be kicked out and put on the street. After Sandy, we're 8 years out, we still don't have everybody back in their homes. We also had to wait a couple of years before there was a lawsuit because the materials that went out to the people who needed information didn't necessarily get it in the right language, didn't get the right materials, didn't necessarily get any materials at all, but they were given some misinformation. So that idea of all of us being ready, you know, we're housing counselors, we're ready. We know who's out there. We know who needs help. We know the communities. We know the other organizations we should be working with. We know who our partners are. We know who the anchor institutions are. We can use that, and we can use our coalitions and collaborations that we've built, and of course all of our members, and work our information out through those sources. That, by the way, is another form of advocacy, because if all of your clients and all of the people you're working with hear the same messaging, get the same information, that all bubbles up. So that's your grassroots approach. While you're helping them, while you're telling them, that is your grassroots advocacy, which bubbles up and will help you get to move along your goal. So those ongoing relationships really matter. And if you want to go to the next slide, please. We don't wait or go to the State House 3 times a year or twice a year. We're in the State House or talking to elected officials or committee chairs or people on the governor's staff. We're talking to them every single day. We are constantly back and forth. We, as an organization, do not hire lobbyists. We work directly with the staff. We work directly with the elected officials ourselves, whether they're U.S. officials, federal officials, or if they're state or local. We do that ourselves. So that keeps us with that long-term relationship. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. And it takes a lot of, we're a small staff. We are 16 people for the entire state of New Jersey. And we really, and not all of them are full-time. And we really make sure that we keep those relationships going, that we keep in touch with people. So we're always reaching out. We're always including them, asking them to participate in events, recognizing them for when they do something that is really positive, and making sure that they see us as a voice that has that grassroots support behind us. So this is one of those things that I wanted, for those of you who are fundraisers or have any fundraising training, that's really, my strong suit. Think of your fundraising tool in the same way you would approach advocacy. So in fundraising, one of the things you talk about is your concentric circles of support. So you got a little circle in the middle, and that circle is who is directly involved in this situation. And those are your first people you reach out to. Then the next circle goes a little bit wider. Who could be impacted or help from this, or how will it benefit others, or who's related to those people? And that's your next circle, and you reach out to them and you work with them. Then you go to the next circle around that, and you say, okay, how will this benefit others? Who can get some kind of a positive in the community? Maybe it's a better looking community. Maybe its property values go up. So who are the people in those circles? And you keep building out that way. And that's how you build your stronger coalition around your advocacy, is to bring in more and more people that will have that impact because you have some center goal that will reach all of them. When you're working with advocacy too, I put on here the local, state, national, and committees within these, because it's not always that you have to get the elected official directly. And remember that. And remember that your local people are the support for your state people, and the other way around. They work back and forth. They come out of a community. You might be talking to somebody that works for the staffer, is the staffer, or you're talking to somebody that's on a committee. Work those relationships as well, because those are the ones that have the ear of the person who votes. And you want to make sure that those are all happening. Would you go to the next one, please, Ellie? So communication strategy. The reason I have this on here is because I want to give you an example of something that we did but also because I think really people don't think of all the tools that are still available to us right now while we're in our stay-at-home orders. You know, when we can all go out and meet in person and go walk across the street to the State House or call a lunch meeting and have everybody together, it's a lot easier to campaign. It's a lot easier to get your messages across. Right now, we have to be creative. So being creative, we just had a town hall online the other night. One of our elected officials that's got a bill that we're very supportive of, she did a Facebook Live, and she was fabulous. And she had 2 of the big city mayors on, and she had 2 other state elected officials, and then a couple of nonprofits, including us. And that conversation and the presentation with seeing people really makes that click. It makes it stick in your head. So don't stick with just the old tried and true, because you can't necessarily do the in-person thing. So the list that I have here are things you can all still do from home. You can all still do this when you are not in the office in your normal situation. So I tried to lay that out for you as well. We had a campaign. You know, a lot of people thought years ago lead paint was taken care of and the children weren't being poisoned anymore. So I like to use this one as an example. We've had a campaign forever about lead paint poisoning. And a couple of years ago, we really focused on our CEO actually said this over at the State House. She said when we had custody, stop using our children as lead detectors. Wow, right? So it's not that big fancy campaign. It's not something crazy. It was that a child who picks up a little bit of the paint dust has learning disabilities, can have permanent damage. You're using them to determine if there's lead in the house. Well, if we can keep our messaging when we're advocating that simple, such a visual, right? And then everybody kind of cringed, you know, when she said it, but then it was like, right, this is the message. We want to protect our children. So if we can come up with messages like that as we're doing advocacy, that's really where you're going to be the strongest in your approach. Would you please switch it, Ellie? So the next page, this we came up with a campaign also in our state, and this was a couple of years ago, and we're still using it. It's called Build a Thriving New Jersey. And we hired a company for this. Now, we don't hire lobbyists, but we did hire a marketing firm that helped us step through the process. And they met with our members and government officials, and they met with department heads, and they did surveys, and they did confidential surveys, and met with our board many times. And this is how we came up with our campaign. And we came up with key components that will be over several years to get these all to happen, because you have to build back up. You're not going to go back up to where you were from the housing crisis. We have to build back up. So this is our document that is our guiding principle. So Build a Thriving New Jersey became our campaign slogan. It's our organization slogan. And if you would switch pages, please, Ellie. We do the shirts, we do the bags, we do the hats, we do the folders, all of our labels all say Build a Thriving New Jersey. So when we do go somewhere and we're wearing these, or we have materials with us that are burgundy and white and they have the logo on it, people know it's all part of the one big group, the big campaign. I've been in a grocery store and seen somebody wearing the shirt, and I have been in other places where I have seen people carrying the bag. So on the next page with research, you heard from 2 previous presenters, and it is important. We have to have research behind what we say. We have to have facts. We've hired Rutgers University, Blaustein School, or the Eagleton Institute to do surveys for us, phone polling. These are all important pieces that support your position and that have credibility behind them. So whenever we can use those, that's probably the best we can do. Please be careful that you don't only do things in English. Know your communities and make sure that when you present and you're doing advocacy, the materials are in more than one language and that they are appropriate to where you are. The other part here too is you know what you want to say, and you know what you want to say to the people that support your issue. How about what you want to, how will you answer the questions of the people that don't? How do you prepare your messaging for them? You know who they are before you even start. So how do you prepare your messaging in a respectful way to say to them, but I hear you and I understand where you're coming from, but this, and this, and here's what the survey said, and here's what the facts say, and here's what the tax impact will be, and here's the jobs that will be created, or here's the people that will be put into a home and no longer in transitional housing. Those are the things you have to have ready. We have one elected official, I'm sorry, not elected official, he's a department head, and he's been around for years and we love him. But his question, whenever we ask for something, is always, okay, so where does the money come from? Where do you want me to take it from? Where should it come from? And so be prepared for that question whenever you're advocating for something. There's normally a dollar impact. So if there is, be prepared with how you would answer that. Now, I know a lot of people would say, that's not my job. You figure out where the money comes from. You know this needs to happen. And sometimes that has to be the answer. But in most cases, if you can say it can come from this, or it will create funds down the road, those are all pieces that are important. Would you switch, please, Ellie? I attached for all of you, and it's on one of the handouts. This is our Thriving Together report. This was our economic impact. It talks about jobs, dollars, taxes, all the money that has been put back into the community because of our community development members. The next slide, please. So we all go to a lot of meetings. When you go to a meeting, make sure that you have your materials with you. Leave a package, not just your business card. Let them have a package with some very brief information. Don't bring them everything you've ever printed out on your printer. Don't bring them every book you've ever had. Bring whatever is appropriate to give an overview of your organization and whatever you're asking for. So if you have a policy priority sheet, bring that. If you have an agency brochure, great. Put your business card in there, obviously. We do everything in burgundy with white labels on it with our Build a Thriving New Jersey label so that they always find it, see it. They always know it's us whenever it's there. They hear from a lot of people. You're not the only one who's going to talk to them, and they're going to hear about a lot of different issues, not just the one you're presenting. So make sure you leave materials behind that are very quick for them to see, oh, this is what they wanted me to do. This is the way they wanted me to vote. Because 4 days later or a week or two later when they're in the session to vote, they may forget unless you made it very, very simple for them. We have a basic fundraising rule, which is people need to be thanked 6 times. Well, it goes the same way with advocacy. People need to hear the message at least 6 times for it to resonate. And I think it's really important for you to realize that that's what you say when you first start the meeting, what you say during the meeting, what you say in the materials, what you say at the end of the meeting, and then if you would go to the next slide, please, what you say after the meeting in your follow-up materials. These are all important pieces. This is a picture from our legislative day last year showing you about 150 people that were crammed into that photo, all wearing the shirts, all walking through the halls of the State House, all with the same messaging. So anyone walking down the hall saw us, knew what we were there about, knew what was going on, and all the legislators knew. They comment on it in a lot of sessions. They'll go, oh, I see all the Build a Thriving New Jersey people are here. So use the visuals. Everybody remembers things differently and learns differently. Use the visuals. The next one, please. I'm almost done, and you're almost to the free offer. So we learned a lot of lessons from Sandy, and we're using them now. One was be ready to work remotely. And when we decided on March 11th we were going home, we walked out of the office with everything we needed to be able to work from home. We were ready. Our phones rang over to our computers with our voicemails onto our cell phones. Everybody had a laptop. We were ready to go. It matters who's in leadership as you go forward with any of your advocacy lessons. Don't put somebody up there that's just going to anger everyone as soon as they walk in the door. Try to put someone in the messaging piece that they recognize, they know they're strong, they know they're going to bring it forward. Your ongoing relationships always make a huge difference. Those were the people that heard from us first, that listened to us, that came to us, and are coming to us now saying, okay, what do we need to do? And remember, when you're dealing with all of this, not all people are treated equally. As I said before, there had to be a lawsuit to be able to get information out that was correct and in the proper languages to all the many areas that were impacted by Sandy. We didn't bring the lawsuit, but we, there was a lawsuit, and that needed to be done. So make sure that you're aware of that. The immigration population, the homeless, seniors, it could be any of those populations or many more that are not being dealt with in a way that's as frequently communicated with them or openly or in a way that they can understand. And if you would go to the next page, please. What we're doing now, if you want to use any of these or call me about any of them, we're working with our governor's office. We have 4 calls per week that are standing calls with different people that are within the government offices. Security deposits can be used for rent payment. That was this past month for May 1st. There is a mortgage forbearance in place that is to move the repayment to the end of the mortgage. No evictions are allowed during this protected period, whether that be from rent or from a foreclosure. Repayment plan for unpaid rent is something we're working to get in place right now. It's a really matter of the amount of days to be provided for that, and that's what's being negotiated at the moment. We're pushing very hard for credit rating not to be impacted by any late mortgage or late rent payment, and also not to have to pay fees for any of that. We're also working on the temporary rental assistance that Marion was talking about earlier that can come through the ESG money, and the temporary project-based landlord assistance, because we don't think all of it can work just on the renter side. We think some of this has to be on the landlord side and then will trickle through to the tenant. So next slide, please. Make sure you say thank you. Time is valuable, and I know your time is valuable, and I just presented to you for a while and gave you a lot of information. You talk to everyone and you thank everyone, whether they agreed with you or not. You know, go back to, what's the book? Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Use it. You thank everyone. If they listened to you, if they met with you, if they let you leave materials, whatever, send them a thank you note. Send them a picture of being there. Send them your policy guidelines. Send them whatever it is you're looking for, but make sure you keep communicating. And here's the last one, and here's what I'm offering. I actually love this stuff. This is fun for me. So if anyone would like to brainstorm of how you want to approach an advocacy campaign or want to know some of the basics, I have a lot of materials that I put together for the workshops I've done over the years on this, and I can give you some ideas of what we're doing now. My contact information is on there, and you are more than welcome to reach out to me, and I will talk through them or help you or put you in the right direction. So I will say thank you for your time and thank you for allowing me to be on here, and I look forward to hearing from some of you.
Great, thanks Sharon so much. And I encourage people on the webinar to reach out to Sharon and make use of her expertise in this area. As you can see, they've done a lot of work in New Jersey, and she can be really helpful to you. So we are going to move to the next presenters, which are Claudia Rilson-Randall with the Community Development Network of Maryland and Michelle Hartson with the Florida Housing Counselor Network. So ladies, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to just say that I am honored today to be part of the anchor leg of the National Housing Resource Center Leaders Call today. And this is a sort of unexpected pleasure because I also got reconnected with Michelle Hartson from Florida Housing Network, who I've known from her days back at the Enterprise Foundation. So I just really appreciate everybody's time today. I know that all of you have been subject to lots of calls, so we're going to just dive right in and go to the first slide. And what I hope to do is basically emphasize some points that have been made throughout this call. And if you remember, some of you may not remember David Letterman, but if you do remember, he always had a top 10 list. So I thought it would be great to have a top 10 advocacy tips for counselors today. And if you don't know who David Letterman is, he's the white guy who preceded Seth and all the other folks, Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert. So, you know, he's the guy. And Michelle, I'm just going to dive right in there and get to our top 10 list. I did also record some sound effects, so just work with me. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Okay, so that's the drum roll for the top 10. And if you couldn't hear it, you can bang on your own desk. So number 10 on the top 10 list is to take some time and tell your clients stories. So I think in general, we've been talking about this and folks have been emphasizing this, our previous presenters did. So just, you know, that's an important piece, is to tell your client stories, talk about what's going on, present the data that's taking place, and really go out there and tell your story. So number 9 is build relationships with advocacy organizations. And I'm going to just turn it over to Michelle to talk a little bit about this and some of the relationships that she's built in Florida.
Well, thank you. And I would like to add to what Claudia said. What an amazing group of presenters today. I'm just grateful for an opportunity to be on this panel and to learn what I've learned today. It's been a tutorial that I appreciate. And I also want to mention that the Florida Housing Coalition, many housing coalitions are represented today. The Florida Housing Coalition is a tremendously impactful organization in the state of Florida, and we work closely with them. I am a little bit unique in that although I'm a founder of the Housing Coalition and worked there for many years, I now focus just on housing counseling. I don't do the full spectrum of housing. So the relationships that I build are incredibly important because we've got the Florida Housing Coalition, legal services, organizations that do tremendous statewide work, and I'm always watching out for the visibility and the revenue generation for housing counseling within housing agencies. So it is a little bit different and unique, and I just agree with the dynamic nature of what everybody covered today on those relationships.
Okay, and let's go to number 8, is build partnerships with state and local departments of housing and community development. And this, some of the other previous presenters have talked about this. I just would say, you know, we have been having meetings and connections with both our city Department of Housing and Community Development, where that's appropriate, as well as the state Housing and Community Development. We've also been talking to them how they will spend their COVID-19 CARES Act funding. I think we really are working all the time to build a relationship that's sustainable and that we know each other. We actually have a standing meeting with the State Department of Housing and Community Development. So we meet with them 3 to 4 times a year, and we talk about issues that are relevant to both of us. And we, talk about legislation, talk about any challenges that may come up. And so what's great about that is just the familiarity. So when there are problems and there are challenges and when there are COVID-19 crises, we know each other. So I would just encourage folks to even if it's only an hour with the secretary, that's what we try to do. We try to have very structured agendas to talk about what are our 2 or 3 priorities, and then we move on to the next meeting. So I just encourage everybody, that's an important piece. Okay, number 7 is build relationships with real estate, banking, and mortgage associations. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I'll be glad. I just want to have a couple comments about 7 and 8 that, sure. And one of the reasons I think Ellie asked me to make a few comments today is because, once again, we have more of a single focus on housing counseling. And so we have actually had action teams from our network that monitor certain foreclosure dollars. We had a situation in Florida where some funds from the mortgage settlement were going to be diverted to another program and would not have benefited our members, the housing counseling agencies. So we put together an action team of our members, and I want to focus on that. Our members do the talking. Our members, I loved the conversation about mobilizing your members, the gentleman from North Carolina. They do all the talking. So the idea of having people, I monitor funding sources, but if something gets in trouble, we organize and go and have those internal meetings. On the relationships with real estate banking and mortgage associations, many of you know probably that our Florida Housing Coalition and the Sadowski Act, we have the largest housing trust fund in the country. And the reason we have it is because of the Sadowski Act coalition. All of those, the real estate banking, home builders all came together and advocated together to get our housing trust fund. And those entities reconvene every year to protect the trust fund. So it's a wonderful example of working with all your partners, but sustaining it. And it's been sustained in Florida since 1992. And those dollars can be spent on housing counseling.
Great. Can we go to number 6, which is borrow and copy strategies from other states and cities? So I just want to, as Michelle just talked about North Carolina, and my colleagues from New York and New Jersey and Florida and Philadelphia, I just think that part of this work is also to take a look at what's going on in other places around the country that you can replicate. And imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. In this work, it's okay to take something that was successful in another city and copy it and call that person in that other city and say, hey, how did you put together this strategy? What did you make? What were the partners? Who was involved? How did you get this done? And then just make it right for your state politics and your state, I would say, ecosystem, whatever systems those are, with the right partners at the table. But you really can learn a lot from what has been done successfully in other states. And I also think that it's important for you to sometimes, when you take a look at those strategies, it takes a long time sometimes for these things to actually yield the results that you want. And sometimes just hearing from someone else about, hey, it took us 3.5 years to do this, is really important. I would just say in Maryland, we just had a major win on the Home Act, which makes it illegal for landlords to discriminate against prospective renters based on lawful sources of income. We've been working on for 21 years on this bill. But I think that just seeing what has been successful in other areas and using different tactics really helped us and helped sustain the coalition to keep working at it. So it's eventually an election that really turned this situation around. But I would just say that, using strategies that have been used in other places is really a great way to go.
And
so
Claudia,
Claudia, let's go to Michelle.
Just real briefly, that what we have found, because our state is so large, we have regional representatives that are members, and we get together and do thought leadership together and peer-to-peer. And so we're sure that we're really looking at every region of the state, because Live Oak and Miami, let's just say North Florida and South Florida, are so tremendously different. But I think that model that we're using, the peer-to-peer exchange and all of that, I want to thank the whole development of today, because I learned so much about who I can even ask. Who can I even ask and strategize with? And so I just want to compliment on number 6, that was strongly supported today. And now I can bring it to all of our members.
Right. So let's go to the top 5. Let's go to the number 5, and I put laughter is the best medicine at the top of the slide on purpose, because you need to show up, be with a positive mindset. Sometimes you're going to be talking to somebody who doesn't want to talk to you or doesn't understand your issue, but that positive work is important. I think the t-shirts in New Jersey where people are seeing the same message for the coalition is great, is a great visual strategy. But I didn't mistakenly put laughter is the best medicine on here. Sometimes wearing a special hat with a logo may get you noticed. So be aware of those things. And my recommendation, number 5, is to show up in your capital at least 3 times per year. This was, I know in New York, you talked about this. It's great to meet somebody in your state capital, but you also may have to also meet them in their local district. Here in Maryland, I really recommend that our organizations visit the Capitol and attend our legislative day in Annapolis. And to use Sharon's words, that's exactly what we've called it. And also that they come and testify on a bill. And maybe part of their testimony is thank you for your support for previous support on funding. But if you show up 3 times a year, then you really get used to coming to the state capitol, and people get used to seeing you. And I think that's important in terms of developing those relationships, that when there's a crisis, people know you already. People have some familiarity with who you are and what you do. Let's just go to number 4. So telling your organization, your local, state, and federal representatives what your organization does and why is just critical in that showing up. You should have a speech that everyone knows in your organization, that can talk easily about what your organization does, who you serve, and why do you do it. I think in terms of housing counseling, when you're telling those stories about having prevented foreclosure, or having helped somebody buy a house, or having somebody budget and get additional benefits, you have those stories. You need to tell your local officials why you do it. Why does it matter? What's your impact? You need to have some of those things easily roll off of your tongue. So I can't emphasize that enough. I think the other thing is it takes practice. Don't worry if you had a bad day and you met somebody and you flubbed it. Go back again. Don't worry about, certainly you have to practice this. It has to become second nature. So I just really encourage people to do that. If you're shy about this work, or you think, oh, well, I'm not an outgoing person, I can't do this work, don't focus on that. Focus on getting your message out there about who you are, what housing counseling agencies do, and how they're helping clients. We have one congressional representative who during the foreclosure crisis was actually really helpful in helping, actually it was Elijah Cummings was really helpful in this, but his staff also really grew to call us and say, listen, I have somebody who needs to go see a housing counselor. That's what you want. So that means they really understand what it is that you do, and you are mutually beneficial to each other. So I just highly encourage that. Let's just go to number 3 because it's quick. Vote. Vote. Everybody on this call, vote. Vote. Tell others to vote, not just for national elections, but your local elections matter. From school board to president, vote. Make sure all your staff votes. Make sure you know who your representatives are in the place that you work and the place that you live. Michelle, do you want to chime in?
No, I want to let you, I think looking at the time and how we probably got about 60 seconds to finish this. I'm done and thank you.
Okay, fill out the census. That's the other thing. When a vaccine rolls out, it's going to be distributed on the basis of census numbers, everybody. Make sure you fill out the census. They've extended the time, but fill out the census. This is critical in terms of voting and political representation. And finally, I would just say drum roll, because that's the top 10 were that David Letterman would use. But I want to say that you got to tell your community story again and again. Show your data, show who it's impacting. Make sure you're telling your story and that you've got data and research to back it up. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much. And thank you to the people who have stuck on. And I'm going to turn it over to Melody and Bruce to see if there's any questions right now. Okay, so we have a lot of questions, and I'm just going to say we're very late in our call, and we'll do our best to get answers to these questions. And Bruce, do you just want to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. So quickly, just a reminder about joining NHRC. This is what fuels our work. We really appreciate the fact that so many of you have joined and renewed. It's actually been a good season in a time when we know that groups are under a lot of stress. So that's great. We really appreciate that a lot. Certainly you can get the credit report discount still, and we are continuing to do the advocacy work we do, and it does allow us to do the kind of lobbying that we do without strings attached. So thanks again for that. So let's just go. We got another call coming up and next week. And so this is going to be around the CARES Act, but around the emergency support grants. This is particularly important. ESG is a tool for preventing homelessness, and it's a tool that can provide assistance through housing counseling to help people, renters in situations that you're going to find people in. We wanted to sort of do a much deeper dive on this particular one because I know that many groups aren't familiar with it. It's been enhanced by the CARES Act, and so we'll have some national experts as well as some local ability to how groups are using these locally. So it's, I think, going to be a useful session for anybody who's thinking about or doing rental counseling. So with that quick note, that'll be next week, and we will continue doing this work. Thank you for all the good work you do out there in the field.